principle of falsifiability. For a theory to be considered scientific, it must be able to be tested and proven false. Source: Karl Popper, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, 1934. And the reason I'm bringing this up from the Bible of the Modern Atheist is I was asked in regard to one of my videos about the null hypothesis why I say God is unfalsifiable, and can I explain why? And that's a great question. For the short version, it's not a hypothesis. For a bit more detail on it though, Karl Popper proposed falsification as a way to weed out the pseudoscience from the science, and essentially for any scientific hypothesis or theory we should have a set of parameters which we can show the hypothesis to be false. Popper viewed the metaphysical claims to be largely unfalsifiable and therefore not part of science. When we talk about God or a godlike character, it's unfalsifiable because it's not clearly defined, and therefore we can't even parameterize it in such a way to create a valid hypothesis. And these vague statements in and of themselves make it difficult to actually falsify anything. So gods in general are not valid hypotheses any more than me telling you about a weird tree that I saw on holiday is. When we talk about specific gods, there might be specific claims about the gods or something within their descriptions that make them somewhat falsifiable. The question came up on a video that I posted about a year ago about the null hypothesis. In that we discussed how we could test the efficacy of prayer. So with a hypothesis such as people being prayed for will heal faster than those not being prayed for, we can operationalize it in such a way that we can, falsify that particular claim. If there is a deity that is directly tied to a claim of healing the sick, then by falsifying the hypothesis, we then falsify the deity in question. The problem with this tends to be is the person can then sort of move the goalposts. They can say that the healing is spiritual healing and not physical. So if we're now in a situation where the healing is spiritual rather than physical, we no longer have a measurable variable, and therefore it is no longer a valid hypothesis. If there is no test that even in principle could show whether a hypothesis is true or false, then it is not falsifiable and therefore not a valid hypothesis. It's merely conjecture. Some might say that simply having evidence makes something falsifiable, and that's not strictly true. For example, I ate a mincemeat burger I made for myself about 5 weeks ago and then cooked on a barbecue, and it's one of the last bits of meat I ate before going mostly vegetarian. This is testimonial evidence. Now, whilst testimonial evidence is one of the weakest forms of evidence, it is still a form of evidence. We'll have different priors as to why you may trust that. You've got previous experience with me, you might know that I'm honest, or you might reason that this is something that someone wouldn't necessarily lie about. Why would someone make this sort of statement? So you might trust it, you might believe it based on my testimony, but that doesn't make what I've said a valid hypothesis or falsifiable in any way. Even something like a lie detector would not make this falsifiable because it's not completely reliable. If I was excited or nervous or on any particular medication, then this particular thing I was saying could show that it was false, or they might not be able to get a steady reading on me at all, so there is no baseline, so they could not show whether I was lying or not. And even with some firmer physical evidence or some digital evidence, it's not necessarily falsifiable. In fact, unless someone had something like an entire day where they followed me around with a camera and they were live streaming, and you could prove that it wasn't a pre-recorded live stream because you can do that, then I don't really think that there is any way that we could show what I was doing was the case. Now, someone could, of course, argue that in the future we might get to a point where there is a 100% reliable form of lie detector. Or perhaps even a form of technology that could follow your waste matter all the way through the sewer and detect what you ate at any moment in time. However, if the definition of falsifiable becomes so loose that it includes anything that we can imagine to be shown false somehow, it would basically make everything falsifiable. Because, that's how our imaginations work. It's kind of ridiculous.
We can argue at some future point in time that X technology will be created, and therefore we could prove this then.
If something is falsifiable in principle, even if we can't do it ourselves in this very moment, it means that there is some way to falsify it currently. If something is falsifiable in theory, we're just saying that we can imagine a way that we could falsify it. And therefore, it's not necessarily something that's actually falsifiable. A hypothesis also usually has some sort of predictive quality about it. If we were to consider something like friction, and let's say friction has an effect on reducing the overall pull of gravity, and not that it actually changes the pull, but let's just say an object, say a ball, would travel slower down a hill where there is more friction. So we could set up and parameterize something where we have just plain concrete on a downhill slope, then we could change different types of surfaces. Perhaps we put a grass surface there, a plastic one, one filled with hairbrush bristles, and so on and so forth. And you could even have one that's completely covered in mud and send this ball to roll down there. We could operationalize a test that could falsify the claim that the speed that the ball runs down a hill is affected by the material that is on the hill, so the surface, the amount of friction that is there. And if that didn't actually have any effect whatsoever, then of course that's then been falsified. If the ball rolled down at exactly the same speed, no matter what the surface was, then friction wouldn't have an effect on, the pull of gravity and the speed of an object going downhill. With something like God exists, it doesn't really have any predictive power at all. There are some things that are more likely under theism, just as there are some things that are more likely under atheism or naturalism. Neither one of them has the sort of explanatory power that precludes the other.
Therefore, in the sense of an extremely broad claim, theism is not something that is falsifiable in and of itself.
If something is falsifiable, it's not simply that there is a tiny piece of evidence that slightly raises the probability that this is false. It's the fact that there is a valid hypothesis presented with the feature of having an ability to be shown false.
This is why some specific God claims are indeed falsifiable, whereas most are not, especially generally speaking. So when I'm talking about theism is unfalsifiable, or gods are unfalsifiable, it's because I'm speaking in a general term. But yes, there are specific claims that are falsifiable.
But the problem, obviously, with these metaphysical entities is the fact that people just then move the goalposts and say, no, you didn't understand that. No, because there's nothing firm there in the first place. And again, when you've got something that can just be changed so readily, do we even bother trying to put it in terms of things like hypothesis, null hypothesis, and so on? No. So, to summarize, why is God unfalsifiable? 1. It's not a proper hypothesis. Theism isn't a proper hypothesis. God exists isn't a proper hypothesis. 2. It hasn't been clearly defined, especially in that statement of God exists. 2b. There are many different gods, and even when you whittle it down to a specific god like the Abrahamic deity, there are so many different takes even within the religion and different denominations that there is no singular specific God claim there. It is still problematically defined. 3. It really depends on how you can operationalize a hypothesis to show whether a particular God is falsifiable or not. The only ones that are clearly falsifiable are the ones that are easily shown to be false because they contain logical contradictions in their descriptions. But even then, someone will say we don't understand it, or that's not what it means, or it's supposed to say X, Y, Z, and we're back to where we were, where someone has moved the goalposts. So no, in general, theism is unfalsifiable, but that's not to say particular gods can't be shown false.